Well, good morning, or are we verging into afternoon? But it's really a pleasure to be here and look out and see all of these faces. And as was said, think about all of the opportunity that awaits you. And I was told not to give a formal presentation of any kind, but really to open it up for questions, which is, I think, very exciting and appropriate. But should I begin by answering the first question that was asked, which was, basically, did you ever imagine that you would be? Let me just say that, my philosophy of life and how I have pursued my career is that, when a door starts to open, you consider going in, and then once you go in, do the best possible job you can, learn as much as you can, and look also, for what the next door might be. Every job that I've ever taken, I've taken largely because I felt that I could make a difference and that I would learn something. And I think, that I've never been let down in any of the jobs that I've held, following that sort of compass for decision making. And I have to say I've had extraordinary opportunities that have gone far beyond what I ever imagined. When I was in college, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a doctor. I entered college thinking I wanted to be a doctor, but truth is I had grown up with two parents who were doctors and lived on the campus of Stanford University. So I didn't have, an absolutely typical growing up experience, but I always sort of thought I'd be a doctor. And then I got to college and I thought, oh my God, there are all these other things I could do. And I thought about pursuing other things. And to be perfectly honest, I took a couple of pre-med classes and I thought, I'm not sure. This is pretty hard. Everybody's competitive. Is this really what I want to do? Is this really the peer group that I want to have? And I actually tried my hand at a few other things. I got involved with journalism. I started to develop interests in the behavioral sciences and child development. I had the opportunity to do some research with a professor, and that was very interesting in child development. And then I took a semester off. Boy. It was an important moment in my life, but it wasn't quite of that magnitude.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
That's quite all right.
But I do have to interrupt you for a minute.
Okay.
We have a little bit of an emergency.
Okay.
We have a little bit of an emergency. I didn't mean to do it that way. I was going to write you a note. Do you see a beige handbag with pins on it and a place where a student got ill?
Book bag.
A book bag, and we need to get that book bag so the student can go in the ambulance. Okay, yeah. Yeah, student got.
Oh, dear.
Okay, all right. Is that it?
Should be.
Okay. I was going to write you a note. Okay, we've got it.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Oh,
great.
dear.
No more interruptions.
All right, well, we wish that student all the best. And it's a reminder about, always being flexible and also the importance of living in the moment. But what I was saying was that I took a semester off and I went to work at the World Health Organization. And I discovered at the World Health Organization that it was a very bureaucratic place. And that if you wanted to really sit at the table, if you really wanted to make a difference, you had to have the right degrees. And there I was, an undergraduate with not even a college degree, and I basically, even though I'd gone there to work on a specific research project, I became a secretary. And in high school, I'd purposely never learned how to type because I never intended to be a secretary, and there I was doing secretarial work. But that made me realize that, I found that my interests were all converging around health and medicine, and made me realize that if I really, was serious about those interests, pursue the education, get the degrees, so that I could have a voice and make a difference. But I thought I would do academic medicine when I first applied to medical school. But then what happened was that I was in medical school. I hate to admit how long ago it was, but I was in medical school during the period when the AIDS epidemic emerged. And I watched this, and first, honestly, in the first year of medical school, and this was Harvard Medical School, we were taught that the era of infectious diseases was over, that advances in antibiotics and vaccines really meant that we could close the chapter, and that the future of medicine was chronic disease. And then we watched these unusual cases of immune deficiency emerge in previously healthy people. And at that time, nobody knew what caused it, and nobody knew what to call it. It was called all different things. It was called 4-H syndrome because of the specific classes of people that were mainly being affected. It was called GRID. It was not clear. Many people thought it was related to substance abuse. Others thought, in fact, it was infectious. And then it was demonstrated by science that it was caused by a virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, and we began to learn much more about the disease. But I went on to New York City to do my residency. And in New York City, you know, sadly, it was an epicenter of AIDS. And I was taking care of many, many HIV-infected individuals. And at that time, we had nothing to offer them, only supportive care. And at that time, it was a major victory, the first time that we actually got someone off a respirator who had something called pneumocystis pneumonia, which was a common complication of HIV disease, and enabled them to live just a few weeks more. But virtually every patient died, and in fact, a fellow resident of mine died from HIV during that period. And seeing how medically we had nothing to offer but supportive care, but how complicated this disease was in terms of the intersections of social issues and economic issues and legal issues and ethical issues with the ongoing medical and scientific challenges that it represented. It made me decide that I wanted, in fact, to pursue public policy, health policy, and public service as my career path. So I sort of went off in that direction. Ironically, around that time, I thought about getting a degree in public health because I thought, you know, if I'm going to do public policy, that might be helpful. And I talked to a number of people, and, you know, I'd done medical school, and I'd done internship and residency at this point, and I was getting older, and I'd had a lot of school. And a number of people said to me, you know, the best way to learn public health, you know, maybe just to immerse yourself in it. And one person in particular said, you know, after all the school you've had, I wouldn't do it. The only job I can think of that you couldn't get would be Commissioner of Health in New York City, because the city charter actually requires that you have a Master's of Public Health. And I said, oh my God, who cares? Who would ever want to be Commissioner of Health in New York City? So I didn't get that degree in public health. To my astonishment, after spending, you know, almost a year in the department as a deputy commissioner, the commissioner left rather abruptly. I was named as acting, but it never occurred to me that I'd become commissioner because I had no master's in public health. But after serving in that role for a number of months, Mayor Dinkins actually asked me to serve as his commissioner, and the city council changed the charter, and it upset a few former commissioners who thought that was a bad idea. Several people offered to enroll me in very quick MPH degrees at a price. But that was certainly, you know, one job that I never expected to have, never sought. But it changed my life forever, and it was an immersion course in public health, and I've become passionate about public health ever since. Similarly, I would have put huge sums of money down even on the day of President Obama's election, that no way would I end up as commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. I thought I might go back into government, but that was not the role I envisioned, or truly the role that I sought. But I was asked to serve, and it really made sense in terms of other things that I'd done in my life, and this is way too long an answer, so I won't go into all of that. But again, the door opened and I went through it, and it's been, one of the most challenging, fascinating, and rewarding positions that I ever expect to have. And so I just encourage all of you to keep an open mind, to recognize that whatever you do, you need to do it well. You need to really take advantage of the opportunities that come before you. You don't need to define a whole career path for you. And surely if you do, it won't be the one that you follow. But I think the critical thing is to have an open mind, to sense when there are interesting opportunities, to always look for activities where you can make a difference, where you can feel fulfilled, and where you will continue to learn.
Questions? Yes. Hold on, here, let's get a student. Right? Student right here. Here's your mic.
It's nice meeting you, and my name is Eliade. I'm a pre-nursing student. My question is, considering the fact that the work that the FDA does is very important, can regulatory science be pursued as any other science like biology, so that it will be faster and less cost and more cost effective to do regulatory work?
Well, I think that to do effective regulatory work, it's a very important question. It really requires developing a very strong foundation of research and developing new knowledge and tools that can be applied to the regulatory process. And that new knowledge and those tools can come from a range of disciplines and activities. It can be basic science research, like discovering biomarkers that can be used to inform us about compounds that are likely to have toxicities if they're developed into drugs. So those drugs, those compounds wouldn't be tested in people where it might actually cause harm. It could be it could be working in the clinical research setting, doing clinical studies to identify whether products are safe and effective. It could be working as a nurse in a clinical setting and helping to report adverse events associated with certain treatments or particular medical products. It could be doing epidemiology and studying populations, looking for adverse events or problems with a given medical product and reporting it, or studying a foodborne outbreak and helping identify the cause. It could be information technology and using data mining to look for emerging safety concerns with a given drug that's in wide use or medical product. There's a whole lot of different aspects to regulatory science. But it really is important in terms of bridging the gap between new discoveries and new opportunities in science, and really making sure that that gets translated into real-world products for people who need them, and products that people can trust, and monitoring those products throughout their whole lifespan in the community, so to speak, because the FDA's responsibilities don't stop when we approve a drug, or don't stop when a food product enters the marketplace. Our responsibilities exist for the whole time that product is available, and whether it's an emerging safety concern or an outbreak of foodborne disease, we are responsible to go in and try to identify the problem and resolve it. I'd say that in addition to building the base of the science and the research and the knowledge that informs regulatory science, also building the cadre of experts who understand regulatory science and the regulatory process is also hugely important, and I think, you know, sort of the opportunity that all of you are poised to embrace. You know, the world of regulatory science is very, very exciting. It involves some of the most interesting cutting-edge science today. It also allows you to work in an area where you really know you're making a difference, where the work you do has as its focus making sure that we get the best possible treatments, cures, and hopefully preventive treatments to people who need them and who count on them, making sure that the food supply is safe, helping people improve their diets to reduce their risk of disease and other things. So it's enormously rewarding to work in this field, and there is, you know, a very direct linkage between what you do and the difference that you make. And it also is an area where, even in difficult economic times, there are lots of career opportunities, and it spans government, industry, and academia. So I think it's a very, very exciting area. I think it hasn't gotten the attention and focus that it deserves. If you look at where we are as a nation, I believe, and I'm actively advocating for this, that we need to make new investments in regulatory science and expand out this field and all of its dimensions, because at the end of the day, it's enormously important for individuals and their health and the health of communities. It's enormously important to the health of our healthcare system, because if we can get those advances in place, we can actually bring down costs and provide better care. It's enormously important to the health of the economy, because critical sectors of our economy depend on regulatory science working, our pharmaceutical industry and biotech. And it's enormously important to the health of our global economic competitiveness. If we want to preserve our preeminence as a nation in the area of innovation and scientific discovery. So I think it's a growing area, I think it's an exciting area, and I hope that all of you will really think very seriously about careers in regulatory science.
Let me see a show of hands for people who want to ask questions. Okay.
And I'll try to give shorter answers.
Good, yeah. We're going to go to that side of the room, then we're going to come here, and then there. How's that? And that may be it. We don't know, but why don't we go?
We all know about the terrible things that happen with the thalidomide. And my lab, I don't know if some of my students are here, we are interested in finding a cure for pregnancy loss and recurrent miscarriages and preeclampsia. And unfortunately, we see now that, it's very important to have these regulations, but after that, we find that almost every drug, but heparin, are considered X category for to use, just because mainly there are no studies in pregnant women. Actually, most of the studies are done in males, Caucasian, 30 years old. So is the FDA going to change the X category anytime soon, or is trying to consider to increase the number of clinical trials in order to make it available to everyone, and especially these women that suffer so bad?
Yeah, well, it's a very, very important question, and it reflects a gap that has existed for a very long time in terms of who participates in clinical trials and whether that really matches what we need to know for the people who ultimately we serve in terms of making critical drugs and medical therapies available. And pregnant women in particular were intentionally excluded for many, many years from clinical studies of any kind because of the vulnerability of the fetus, which we can all understand why there would be caution, but in fact, when you look at the reality, pregnant women take more drugs than the average person in many instances, yet they're untested, and is that a better situation? Probably not. So FDA actually has made a major push in this area. I can't take credit for it. It began before I got there, but it's certainly something that I support, to actually develop a program to make sure that important drugs are tested in women making sure we have gender equity and other demographics, including race and ethnicity, and age, well represented in clinical studies. Both the elderly and the pediatric populations have been underrepresented in clinical trials to their detriment, because you can't treat a child like a small adult and assume that you can just take an adult dose and cut it in half or reduce it by weight, because the physiology of kids is actually different. Similarly, with the elderly, you can't assume that they're just like a healthy 35-year-old, because important aspects of their physiology, like kidney function and liver function, is almost certainly at least somewhat impaired, and that affects how the drug levels exist and how the drugs are metabolized and excreted. So we have made a big push to try to ensure that clinical trials embrace the spectrum of demographics that need to be studied, and developing programs specifically for pregnant women that are very carefully designed, both in terms of the scientific technical issues and the ethical issues, but that will provide women with important information so they can make informed and safe choices about what drugs to take during a pregnancy.
That's great, thank you. Okay. So we have 3, we have 1, 2, and 3, if we can get there. So it's right here.
Okay, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to meet you in person. My name is Paul, and I'm from Bronx Community College, chemistry major. I have 2 questions. But before these 2 questions, right? We know that every year is doing
1 question.
One.
Just 2 short ones.
1.
Okay.
2, you will have none.
I know the FDA is doing very incredible job by before approving a drug. I know that it takes at least 10 years to do that, which means these drugs have to go through rigorous inspection processes. But my question here is, if it takes 10 years, at least 10 years for FDA to approve a drug, some of these drugs doesn't last for even 2 years on the market. So now, I want to know from you, what are some of the processes that the FDA goes through, and where exactly does the FDA last, or what actually happened for these drugs to go through this 10 years of rigorous inspection, and after less than 5 years, they have to be recalled? Thank you very much.
Well, it's a really complicated question and a lot of different issues embedded in that question. But let me just briefly say that, sort of on average, a number that's often used is that a drug will take, around 10 years from the sort of the initial discovery through the whole process of the initial, sort of proof of concept to the development of the product and the clinical testing with the safety studies and the efficacy studies, and then the FDA approval. And very often, by the time the drug gets to market, it either has bankrupted the company and, or there are new competitors or whatever. And so from a industry point of view, they want to see those timelines reduced, because if they want to make investments and have effective products. From the patient point of view, if you have a serious disease that doesn't have a treatment, you don't want to have to wait 10 years from the time of a discovery of a good idea to an actual product that you can use. And from the FDA point of view, it's just too long. So we are trying very hard to see what we can do to really streamline and modernize our piece of the regulatory process. And there are a number of strategies that we're using. One is, we know that if we engage with the sponsor of a product early and really help lay out and define what's the kind of data we're going to need and the kinds of studies early, we can telescope down some of the time frame. Also, if we can really develop and modernize the tools and methodologies that we use, we can cut down some of the time. For example, I mentioned about the biomarkers for toxicity. You know, only about 1 in 10 products that start to be developed actually make it all the way through the process, not because the process is inefficient, but because just as you go through the development process, you discover that it doesn't work. Well, the earlier you can discover it doesn't work and just, you know, start on something new, the better off everybody is. You don't want to waste time, you don't want to waste money on a drug that's going to fail. So, you know, applying better science in terms of that early toxicity, trying to develop new, more innovative strategies for clinical trials that might use surrogate markers or endpoints other than death in certain cases so that you can get an answer sooner, that the drug is having an effect. All those things can make a difference in shortening that time frame. The other part of your question had to do with, you know, sometimes after a drug is approved, you discover a safety problem and it gets pulled from the market. Now, that doesn't happen all that often. You hear about the things that are pulled. You don't hear about the things that are out there. But when there's a safety problem, we obviously have a very serious obligation to address it, and we address it in different ways. Sometimes we study it more, and we may require the company to do additional clinical studies, and sometimes, you know, basic laboratory studies to inform all of us on the nature of the safety concern. We also, you know, have to look at risks and benefits. If there's a safety problem, but it's a terminal, serious, lethal disease that has no other treatment, you're willing to put up with a certain level of safety risk because of the benefit. If it has a big safety risk and it's the common cold, or a big safety risk and there's 16 other drugs on the market that don't have safety risks, then that drug is more likely to be pulled. So there's quite a, you know, set of activities and calculations that have to be gone through before you decide how you're going to handle a safety concern in a drug that appears after it's been approved. But the truth is that we expect to see safety issues emerge once a drug is in the marketplace, because when you're doing the original studies, it's a relatively small number of people that are part of those clinical trials, you know, several thousand at most in most instances, and people that are selected so that you can get clarity of the data collected. You don't choose people that have a lot of other medical problems and are taking a lot of other drugs in your original clinical studies to demonstrate safety and efficacy. But when you go into the real world and suddenly millions of people are taking these drugs, and they're people that have other you know, concomitant medical problems or taking other drugs, are elderly or, you know, and have, you know, different reactions or whatever, you expect you're going to start to see some safety problems. And that's why, again, applying the best possible science as those safety issues emerge and doing the risk-benefit analysis is absolutely critical to good decision-making. So it's a complicated question that you ask with a complicated answer, and I apologize for going on so long.
No, and I'm glad you only asked one. Can you imagine if you had asked a second one? And I'm going to take the privilege of being sort of the chair to ask a different kind of question, if I might. And then, and I don't know how your time is going, if we might have just 2 more after that. Okay? Do you want your water?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I want to ask a different kind of question.
Thank you.
And I want to ask it sort of wearing your commissioner's administrative hat,
Okay.
if you will. I want you to just talk a little bit about the people who work at the FDA.
Okay.
You know, the size of the agency, where they are located, who the people are, and what kind of backgrounds some of the various people have. Because we've certainly been focusing appropriately on the science, but there is more than science at the FDA. So might you respond to that?
Well, it's a big, complex agency. There are about 11,000 employees at the present time, and a budget of several billion dollars. We have offices that are mainly located in the Washington area, but even in the greater Washington area, we're in multiple sites. But we have offices around the world, ranging from Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou in China, to Mumbai and New Delhi in India, to Chile and Costa Rica and Mexico City, and really literally all around the globe, and all across the nation we have regional offices. And we employ quite a range of people. We, of course, have scientists, physicians, and public health professionals. We have a lot of lawyers, because everything we do happens within a very well-defined legal regulatory framework. And for every product that we oversee, unfortunately for me, has a different legal regulatory framework. So just when I think I've mastered one area, I try to apply it to another and say, no, it's a different standard, a different set of laws and requirements. And we regulate products that account for between 20 and 25% of every dollar spent on consumer products in this country: drugs, devices, biologics and vaccines, dietary supplements, cosmetics, foods, animal foods, and also animal drugs, things that emit radiation, and now tobacco. So we have a huge range. A lot of our important work happens on the ground by people that have undergraduate degrees or masters, but are not lawyers and are not, scientists, physicians, or other, doctoral level employees. A lot of our really important work goes on in what we call our inspectorate, and these are the people that are actually on the front lines, inspecting facilities, engaged in outbreak investigation, working with companies to ensure compliance with FDA standards and expectations. That really is important. And then, of course, all of our work is supported by a group of people that really hold us together, the support staff, who have to be pretty sophisticated in many ways, but have all different levels of education and experience. And I'm happy to say that a lot of people that come into the FDA think they're coming in for a year or two and then spend a career at FDA. There's a real sense of mission. People that come in, really become converts to the work of FDA. It's a very rewarding and exciting place to work.
Okay, thank you. So the last two questions then. This gentleman, take the microphone, please, and then this lady here.
Commissioner, the pharmaceutical manufacturers claim that they have to charge so much money for medication to recover their expenses in research and development. However, we all know that they spend far more money on marketing than on R&D. What is the FDA doing to see to it that they increase their allocations to R&D?
Well, that goes beyond our mission and our mandate in terms of, telling a drug company how to spend their money. I think, though, that we are part of an environment that is making the pharmaceutical industry rethink some of how they're doing business. I think that, in recent times, many companies really made their money by having blockbuster drugs and then a lot of copycat or Me Too drugs. But the world has changed, and there's I think a new recognition that where the great opportunities are isn't so much in some of the development of new chemical compound drugs, but in the biologics area, which is much more scientifically challenging, developing different kinds of proteins that modulate immune response or enable you to interfere with different feedback loops or mechanisms, underlying mechanisms of disease, or in trying to really harness the discoveries of the genome and apply that to new opportunities for therapy and personalized medicine. And so I think there's a renewed appreciation that really deepening the bench on science and investing in R&D really matters to being able to develop the products. What's the challenge is, that as we were talking about earlier, a lot of drugs that are developed fail, and there is, a long time frame for taking a discovery and a new innovation all the way through to an approved product. And when money is tight, especially, but if you're a company and looking at your bottom line, the more uncertain that regulatory pathway is, the less likely you're going to be to want to invest. So, one of the things that we're doing is really trying to streamline and modernize the regulatory pathway, as I mentioned before, and really trying to apply cutting-edge scientific knowledge and tools to how we actually undertake the regulatory process. And I think that, there are real opportunities, and we're starting to see it in practice, to make the regulatory process more efficient but equally effective. And I think that can help to perhaps rejigger some of the economics of drug development as well. But it's a complex issue, and the other factor in all of this is, who does the original discovery work, and how do companies work with academia or government scientists in terms of the different stages of discovery and development. But this is a pretty dynamic time in the pharmaceutical industry, I think, and a pretty dynamic time at FDA in terms of how we are addressing regulatory issues. And I think that it's a pretty important time in terms of our ability to really take advantage of all of the opportunities that exist in science and technology today to make sure that they really do get translated into real-world products at affordable cost.
So we have a final question from this young lady, who's a student here, I think.
I'm actually a registered student at City College.
And that's fine. You're in your family.
My question to you is that in recent times there's been significant advances in the field of genetics, especially with regards to genetically modified foods. What system, what concrete system is in place to regulate the entrance of these foods into the market, and what is being done to let consumers know if they're genetically modified?
Well, again, a complex question, but very timely.
I think you're up to it, Commissioner.
First, let me just say that, genetically modified food has existed since, practically the dawn of agriculture in terms of, breeding and genetic manipulation of food products. Obviously, as technologies have become much more sophisticated, there's an actual genetic manipulation that sort of shifts, the playing field in meaningful ways, and has done, quite a lot in many aspects to help expand the food supply in the Green Revolution and all of that. But as I'm sure you're aware, there are concerns that are raised by consumers about what does this genetically modified food really mean. Some of the genetically modified food issues are related to components of agriculture and outside the purview of the FDA, but there certainly are genetically modified genetically modified seeds and that kind of thing, but genetically modified foods are something that we provide oversight for, and we do have requirements for demonstration of, that these products do not demonstrate harm, and that the food product itself is not measurably different from the non-genetically modified food product. We are in the middle of a very interesting discussion within FDA and beyond around the first genetically modified animal food product, most of the genetically modified food has been seeds and plants, but there's a genetically modified salmon that has been submitted to the FDA for review, and they're seeking approval. And it has a genetic modification that affects the release of growth hormone, so that it's continuously released as opposed to episodically as it occurs in nature, so it grows to full size much more quickly. It's being grown in isolated tanks in the mountains in South America at the present time, not in open waters, and it is being studied in terms of both environmental impact and the safety of the food product, and if there are any differences between the flesh of a genetically modified salmon and a wild salmon or a farm-raised salmon. And so all of that is being studied as we speak, and we've had some public meetings, and one aspect of this is also, should it be labeled as genetically modified? And the FDA law, I mentioned that we operate under a lot of statutes and legal requirements. The FDA law is very specific that we only would label it if we felt there was reason to believe that it was substantially different from naturally occurring salmon. And that's, in this case or in other genetically modified food cases. Genetically modified food at the present time is not labeled. So I think I probably need to stop. I appreciate your forbearance.
We appreciate your thoughtfulness. Another round of applause, please, for the commissioner. Yes, thank you so much.